Thanks very much, Amy, for your introduction. Yes, and as you mentioned, I'll be talking about some of the exotic disease threats that are currently facing Australia, as well as talking a little bit about ways in which we may deal with them if they happen, and some of the practical things that that you can do in terms of preventing them from happening. So I know when I've done Word documents and that type of thing, and I'm not sure whether it's the case right at the moment, but for a very long time the word biosecurity would have a red line under it, which would mean that it was something that Microsoft Word didn't recognise as being a word. But certainly, I think in the last 3 years, with the advent of COVID-19, and then some of the exotic animal disease risks that we've been facing, we would have seen a lot of media interest in foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease last year as being threats that biosecurity has very much become forefront in people's minds, which I think in some ways is a good thing, because having a good awareness of biosecurity probably reduces the risk of some of the things that I'm about to talk about from happening. One thing about Australia, and we've had a very fortunate history in that we've got a natural barrier, being an island nation. And for decades, we've been in a fortunate position of not having a lot of the exotic diseases that other countries are having to deal with. Many of the diseases that I'll talk about today are endemic diseases in other countries. They're diseases that those people have to live with as a day-to-day thing. But the threat or the risk of us seeing some of these diseases in Australia has been exponentially increasing over the last few decades. And the reasons for that is that we're very much, we've become much more part of the global supply chain. So there are increased numbers of travel movements. There's increased trade coming from other countries into Australia. There are people who try and circumvent the system, and all of those things are only increasing the chances that we'll see disease come into Australia. And then we've got other factors at play, like climate variability. And a good example of a disease which was definitely not on anybody's radar last year was Japanese encephalitis, which we've found all throughout northern Victoria. It's been throughout New South Wales and Queensland as well, whereas previously it had only been detected in the Torres Strait. Whether that's because of climate change, it's anybody's guess, but certainly climate variability would have played a role in it moving that far south. So yeah, as I mentioned, the threats are only ever increasing. There is a little bit of a Victorian-centric to this presentation, just because of where I work, but I think that it would be fair to say that a lot of the statistics that I'll be quoting would apply equally in the other states in which people may be listening to this presentation. So for every Australian state, agriculture makes up a very large part of their economy. And the agriculture in all of those states has a very high dependence on export markets. I've given the example there of 70% of livestock products being exported. And most of the countries to which we export also have very high biosecurity standards. So if you think of our major export partners, countries like the United States, Japan, South Korea, Europe, they all have very high biosecurity standards. And if we were to have an exotic disease that those countries don't have, very quickly we would lose our export markets to them. The other thing about Australian agriculture is that in Australia, there are only so many mouths to feed. So we very much rely on being able to export our products to be able to make agriculture a sustainable industry for Australian farmers. And if we were to lose those export markets, in some cases, some of the Australian agricultural industries would no longer be viable. Once again, I'll talk about the Victorian example, but I think that you'll know as I show the next slide that it applies to the other states as well. But one of the comments that I heard after the 2001 outbreak in the United Kingdom of foot and mouth disease was, well, that was the United Kingdom. This is Australia. It wouldn't happen in that way here. But when we look at say the Victorian example, we've got a lot of similar characteristics to what they had in the UK. So we've got a relatively dense population of livestock. We have quite a bit of movement between those properties. We have a mix of species. We have a climate which in many times of the year are quite conducive to the spread of those diseases. And we have plenty of movement that goes on both within the states and into other states. And other things about the diseases that we're most worried about, and so if we think of examples like foot and mouth disease, lumpy skin disease, they do just as well in a warm tropical type environment as they do in a cold wet environment. So the exotic diseases that we're most concerned about would do just as well in Australia from their point of view as what they do in the countries in which they're endemic. And this is I always think of as being quite a sobering slide because what it shows is the amount of sheep movements that happened through sale yards in a week in December 2021. And there was nothing special about that week. You could show a slide for any other week of the year and you would see a very similar picture. But what you can see there is that there were plenty of movements that were coming from quite a long distance into some of these sale yards, and which is shown, I think, by the blue lines, and then even larger distances for livestock leaving the sale yards, which is shown by the red lines. One thing that this slide doesn't show are all the movements that happen property to property. That hasn't been captured in this slide. And also movements of other susceptible species like cattle and pigs hasn't been shown in this slide. So you can imagine that if there was, say, a highly infectious exotic disease like foot and mouth disease that went through a sale yard, say in the southwest of the state, for example, like here in Hamilton, that effectively, because it's such an infectious disease, we would probably have foot and mouth disease all throughout southeastern Australia just as a result of that event. I'll talk about some of the ways that we can prevent this from happening. But when we look back at the UK 2001 outbreak, what happened there was something akin to this slide. It happened through the movement of sheep through sale yards. It happened through more than one sale yard, and it happened over about a 3-week period before they realised that they had a problem. And so, as you could imagine, in 3 weeks, if it was anything like this, that disease would be quite well entrenched in the country before they realised they had an outbreak. And that was exactly what happened in the UK back in 2001. So we'll now consider some of the diseases that we're most worried about. And there are quite a few diseases that are exotic to Australia. What I'm showing in this slide are the ones that we see as being our biggest threat. And so, and also it gives a probability, a likelihood of these diseases occurring in Australia sometime in the next 5 years. And the way that these percentages were determined, it was and I know that they are just statistics, but there was a bit of scientific rigor behind it, in that there was a group of people who were given the task of, through things like mathematical modelling, to work out what they saw as being the risk of each of these exotic diseases coming into Australia in the next 5 years. Then they got together as a group, put forward their case, then they went back and recalculated their risks as a result of their discussions with other colleagues, and they came up with these type of figures. So for the case of foot and mouth disease, they estimate that somewhere in Australia in the next 5 years, there's an 11.6% chance of us having an outbreak. For the disease lumpy skin disease, 28%, so that's just more than 1 in 4 chance. African horse sickness, 13%, and African swine fever, 21%. So I guess in some ways it depends a little bit on your appetite for risk, but I would think that for a disease which would have such a devastating impact as foot and mouth disease, having a bit more than a 1 in 10 chance of it happening in the next 5 years, to me would seem a fairly significant risk. Some people may say, oh, well, this is all stuff that's pie in the sky. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and unfortunately, we have some fairly good examples of exotic diseases that have come into Australia in recent years. So you may remember the equine influenza outbreak back in 2007, which very much impacted New South Wales and Queensland. Avian influenza, which in Victoria we had just 2 years ago. We had the largest avian influenza outbreak in Australian history just 2 years ago. And if you follow the media, you'll see that there's plenty happening with avian influenza around the world. Australia and Antarctica are actually the only continents at the moment that don't have avian influenza, which wouldn't give us any real comfort. And also plant diseases. So we've had an incursion of capra beetle in the last few years. And then we've got those ones at the bottom. Varroa mite is something that New South Wales is currently grappling with. That's probably the most serious disease of bees. And that was identified in New South Wales last year, and they're still trying to eradicate it at the moment. So there are plenty of fairly recent examples of exotic diseases that have come into Australia. Right, I'll talk about some of the ones that you're possibly most interested in, the ones that have certainly been given the most recent publicity. And so I'll talk about foot and mouth disease first. And foot and mouth disease is a disease of cloven-hoofed animals. That's those animals with 2 digits. And you can see there on the slide that the range of species that it affects. The reason that it's called foot and mouth disease is that it causes lesions both in the mouth in the form of vesicles, which are like blister-filled or blisters to begin with, that then go on to burst. And that's why foot and mouth disease is also an example of a vesicular disease. As well as those lesions being in the mouth, it will also cause lameness, it'll cause fever, and it'll cause quite a severely ill animal, although in the case of adult animals, it's quite rare that it'll cause the mortality of the animal. Probably one of the main features of foot and mouth disease is its transmissibility. Of all of the viral diseases of animals, there's probably no more transmissible or readily transmissible disease than foot and mouth disease. And so once it comes in contact with susceptible species, it spreads very quickly. And in some ways, this slide is a bit misleading to read, because I think that my brain always thinks that if something's in grey, there's probably not much happening there. But in the case of this slide, it's the complete opposite. All of those countries that are shaded there in grey pretty much live with foot and mouth disease as an endemic disease. So there are plenty of countries in the world in which foot and mouth disease is well and truly entrenched. There are some pretty notable exceptions as well, and I mentioned earlier on North America, Europe, and Japan. And up until April last year, Indonesia, just north of Australia, was also free of foot and mouth disease. But that changed in April of last year, and ever since then, Indonesia's been dealing with an outbreak of foot and mouth disease. And when I showed those percentages earlier, one of the reasons why the percentage risk of foot and mouth disease coming into Australia increased was because of its presence, its newly found presence in Indonesia, our nearest neighbour. And so at the time, as you would have heard, there was also quite a bit of interest in foot and mouth disease. I'm kind of hoping that interest has possibly decreased the risk of it coming into the country. Around about July, August, September of last year, I was giving this presentation quite regularly because of the interest in foot and mouth disease. But foot and mouth disease is certainly still there in Indonesia, and it presents the same risk now as it did back then. And then you've also got all of those countries shaded in grey, which are also a potential risk to Australia. So back in 2001, I was one of a number of Australian veterinarians who went across to the UK and dealt with the outbreak of foot and mouth disease there firsthand. I was in the northwest of the country, up in Cumbria, up in the northwest, which was the most heavily affected part of the country. I was there in April 2001, which was the peak of the epidemic. And I worked there for 4 weeks. And after working there for those 4 weeks, I think from my point of view, the only saving grace was that I could hop on a plane and come back to Australia, where we weren't having to deal with what we were having to deal with in the UK, because it was a pretty awful experience, and it was one that I would hope we never see happen in Australia. But you can see some numbers there of numbers of infected properties, numbers of livestock that were culled. There were plenty of consequences of all of that, and I'm sure that those consequences are still being felt in the UK up until today. And of significance, possibly of more significance to Australia than it was at the time to the UK, was their loss of international trade. So I did mention that countries live with foot and mouth disease as an endemic disease, and they live by, if they can afford it, vaccinating their animals, their livestock, for foot and mouth disease. So there are ways of living with the disease, but unfortunately, those countries are not able to freely trade with other countries because of their foot and mouth disease status. And so from the Australian point of view, the loss of international trade would probably be a whole lot larger than the outbreak itself. Then another disease which gained a lot of publicity 12 months ago was lumpy skin disease. It's a disease that's never been seen in Australia. It's a disease just of cattle and buffalo. It causes, it's quite a well-named disease in that it causes, it's a viral disease which causes lumps on the skin of the animal, as well as causing other illness in the animal, such as fever, depression, loss of appetite. It's transmitted by insect vectors, and we have plenty of insect vectors in Australia that would be able to transmit it if it came into Australia. And it's another disease that came into Indonesia just about a month or so before foot and mouth disease. And so we're very worried in Australia of the idea, well, there's a possibility that it could come in a similar way to foot and mouth disease through, say, a piece of contaminated meat or some dirty footwear or something like that. But in the case of lumpy skin disease, it's probably more likely to come in by being blown across the Timor Sea into northwest Australia. And you could imagine that if it got into our extensive livestock, our extensive cattle populations up there in northwest Australia or Northern Territory, that it would become very difficult to control. And so we do see it as there being a reasonable risk of that happening. Once again, I hope that it doesn't happen, because most of our important trading partners don't have lumpy skin disease, and very quickly, even if we weren't in a state where lumpy skin disease was present, we would still lose our export markets because of it. So it's had an interesting history. It was traditionally just a disease found in Africa, and then back in, as you can see in the maps there, back in 2005, it was seen in the Middle East for the first time. Then it steadily spread its way across through Asia, through countries like Russia, and then down into China, and then finally into Indonesia last year. So it's never been closer to Australia than what it is now. And as I say, hopefully we won't see the jump across the Timorese Sea into Australia, because it would be a real problem to us if it did come into Australia. So you might ask what plans we've got in place for dealing with an exotic disease incursion if it came into Australia. And for probably, just thinking, 30 plus years, we've had plans in place called AusVet Plan. And those plans cover a whole range of different facets of dealing with an exotic disease outbreak. And so the types of things that would happen in the advent of an exotic disease, and I'll use the avian influenza outbreak of a couple of years ago as a good example, because all of them were used during that. Quarantine of the properties on which the disease is found, which are those red dots. Then there would be the establishment of restricted areas, which is this pink area of the map. Also the establishment of a control area, which also has forms of movement restrictions, which is the yellow area of a map. We would be tracing movements of animals, people, machinery, equipment, between properties that we see as being either infected or what we know as dangerous contact premises. And as a result of that, surveillance would be guided, in which we would be testing and monitoring stock. In the case of foot and mouth disease and also avian influenza, as we saw 2 years ago, we would also be having to dispose of the susceptible animals on those infected premises and decontaminate those premises afterwards, which, as you would appreciate, is a very unpleasant task, both for the people who are having to carry it out, and particularly for the people who own those properties that are affected. Those people would be compensated for what they lose, and so there are plans in place to compensate people for the animals that would have to be destroyed as a result of an exotic disease response. And then when all of that was done, we would have to prove to the rest of the world through disease surveillance that we were free of that disease before our export markets reopened again. And as has been seen with the UK experience and other countries' experience, that can take some time after the disease has in fact been eradicated. So now I'll talk a little bit more about our preparedness And I know that I'll sometimes hear the comment of well, if they did their job at the border, we wouldn't have to worry. Um, which which is a reasonable enough thing. But the problem is there will always be ways in which people or product or whatever will get past that. And so what this slide demonstrates is one that kind of shows that everybody has a role to play in protecting the country against exotic diseases. And also what it shows is that if there are enough different layers of protection, it's a little bit like Swiss cheese. So these viruses, which are the little green dots, will get through some of the holes, but eventually they'll come across a barrier that they can't get through, and it's that barrier that stops them coming in contact with Australian livestock. So certainly our border control is a very important part of that, but there are so many other things that we need to be looking at to stop exotic diseases from coming into the country. And I guess if we look at some of the examples that you can employ yourselves, there'd be things like preventing swill feeding, so preventing pigs from being given meat products. It would be by having an on-farm biosecurity plan, so that when visitors come onto a property, there are procedures in place or planning in place to reduce the chances of them bringing something onto the property. So there are plenty of things that can happen once you get past border security that will limit the chance of an exotic disease coming into the country and establishing itself. Our government departments, and I think that the other state departments would be doing exactly the same things as what we're doing in Victoria, have got a number of processes in place which are very much there to reduce the chances of the worst happening, and if it did happen, being able to quickly do something about it. So we've got traceability of livestock. We've got disease surveillance programs for ready detection. We've got a compliance role for things like swill feeding. We've got we carry out regular training and exercise programs. And we also go through contingency planning. So there are a number of ways in which the state departments are working to try and circumvent the possibility of an exotic disease outbreak. And I think it would be fair to say that each state's animal health and welfare department are there. Probably that would be their primary reason for existence, is doing those things, because it's very much a case of market protection. So yes, as I say, everybody has a responsibility, and a key number. It's an Australia-wide number. Is that number that I've got down there in the bottom right of the screen, the Emergency Animal Disease Watch Hotline, that 1-800 number. So I think that we encourage any livestock producer to be aware of that number, and if they see something suspicious, to report it to that number, and then it'll be promptly dealt with from there. I know that there will be other sessions in this series that will be coming up, so I won't talk too much about biosecurity planning, because I'll be stealing, I think, the next presenter's thunder if I do so. But I will just mention at this point that it's important for your property to have an on-farm biosecurity plan. I mentioned before the importance of early detection and that 1-800 number, as well as having a biosecurity plan, to also employ that biosecurity plan by doing things like keeping good records, good basic farm biosecurity, etc. But I won't spend too much time on that slide, because I think that this slide is pretty much the topic of the next presentation in this webinar series. But some of the things that that we're often asked about in relation to exotic diseases, I thought I would just quickly cover now. And so if there was a strong suspicion of a disease, and it pretty much applies mostly to foot and mouth disease, if there was a strong suspicion of foot and mouth disease, what would happen immediately would be a livestock standstill. And that initially would be nationwide. It initially would be for 72 hours. And what would have to happen is that animals would not be able to be transported in that time. And if they were being transported, they would either need to return to where they began their journey, or else they would need to be taken to a holding facility where they could be offloaded. And the reason for that, it's not because we think that every livestock transporter travelling around Australia is carrying livestock that carry foot and mouth disease, but what it would be doing is buying us time to work out where the disease most likely is. And so, and also potentially stopping the spread of disease in the process. So it's 72 hours to buy us the time to be able to carry out the traces that we need to know to be able to have a better appreciation of how far and wide foot and mouth disease is likely to have spread, and at the same time stopping a few potential new movements. So that would be a very obvious immediate effect of the suspicion of foot and mouth disease. The property on which the disease was suspected would also be put under a form of quarantine until it was established whether the disease, that property had foot and mouth disease or not. And we do see that happen from time to time, because there are other diseases that can resemble foot and mouth disease where there's the need for that to happen. Doesn't happen very often. We do exclude exotic diseases very regularly. Having strong suspicion of an exotic disease doesn't happen quite as frequently, but it does happen from time to time. Another question that people will ask is, well, if foot and mouth disease is a disease that doesn't kill livestock and there's an effective vaccination against it, why don't we preemptively vaccinate the Australian herd? Which is also a reasonable thing to ask. So with foot and mouth disease, if we did have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, we would possibly vaccinate for it. It wouldn't be our first and most preferred strategy. We would be trying to eradicate it rapidly. And sometimes in some ways vaccination doesn't help with that process, but certainly if it was needed as a form of control of the disease, then it would potentially be used. The reason that we wouldn't just preemptively vaccinate our Australian herd now is that the moment we started using foot and mouth disease vaccine in Australia, we would lose our foot and mouth disease free status as far as our trade partners are concerned. And a good analogy is the case of Brazil, where from time to time they do have outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, and from time to time they vaccinate. They'll have areas of their country vaccinated. Brazil is not able to trade their cattle or their livestock products in any way like we can in Australia. So that's the reason why, but certainly in an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, vaccination would be a consideration as part of the control strategy. And another question that gets asked is whether I should have a foot bath. And I think my answer to that, it very much is a property to property thing. And I think that the best thing that you could do first would be to put together an on-farm biosecurity plan, The reason I say that is that on-farm biosecurity plans are very much property specific, and what works for one property isn't necessarily going to work for another. So a good case in point is that an intensive piggery in Victoria is going to have a far different biosecurity plan than, say, an extensive cattle property in Western Queensland. So yeah, and if, say, you've got a school farm, then your biosecurity plan at your school farm is going to have is going to include things that other properties probably don't really need to consider. So every property's got their own sort of unique set of circumstances, and that's why it's hard to give a hard and fast answer to that question. Just one thing, often people will ask about what they can use to decontaminate against a disease like foot and mouth disease. And the good news is that it's a virus that is very easy to kill with disinfectants. In fact, if we were to have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Australia, we would be using citric acid, which you could find it on the shelf in Woolworths, citric acid. We would be using citric acid as our primary form of decontamination. So even though it's a serious disease, it doesn't necessarily have to have a very high-tech type of decontaminant. So I think I've been talking now for about 45 minutes, which is probably about as much as you'd want to hear from me. I just leave you there with a few key websites that you're welcome to link into, as well as the important one at the bottom, Beyond Blue, because obviously concerns such as these for a producer, a lot of what I've just spoken about, even though I say that people have a responsibility of biosecurity and all the rest, unfortunately for a producer, they don't have a lot of control over whether a disease like lumpy skin disease or foot and mouth disease comes into the country. And we all know that sometimes the things that cause us the most stress are the things that we don't have complete control over. And then if they do happen, I would think that would have a huge impact on the mental health of our people who live in rural Australia. And so I think that groups like Beyond Blue would become extremely important.